She walked into the courtroom with the kind of poise she had spent decades perfecting, shoulders back, chin lifted, every step calculated. But today, it all felt like a fragile mask barely clinging to her face. Her palms were cold, slick with sweat, though the room was perfectly climate-controlled. As she passed the gallery, whispers rippled behind her like wind through tall grass. Her name was no longer just a name. It was a headline, a scandal, a fall from grace. But even that wasn't what made her chest tighten as she approached the defense table. It was the man seated high above on the judge's bench who stopped her breath cold. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't think. She just stared, and he didn't blink, didn't nod, didn't react. He simply stared back, calm and silent as if he were made of stone, but she recognized him. God, how could she not? That face, those eyes. Older now, hardened but unmistakable. Time had added gravity to his jawline and confidence to his posture, but beneath it all, he was still that boy. The boy she once read bedtime stories to. The boy who clung to her hand at Sunday service. The boy who called her his godmother, not by blood, not by law, but by something even deeper, trust. She remembered the way he used to smile when she showed up with school supplies and ice cream. The way he lit up when she promised, "I'll always be there for you." And she remembered the day she broke that promise. She had left without a word. No goodbye, no explanation, just vanished. She told herself at the time that she had no choice. Her career was demanding. The case she took out of state needed her full attention, and besides, he wasn't her responsibility. But deep down, she knew. She left because she didn't want to feel, didn't want to be tied down, didn't want to care too much. And now here he was, 27 years later, wearing a judge's robe and holding her life in his hands. She was the defendant, charged with defrauding elderly clients, an accusation she couldn't outrun. And he was the one who had every right to hate her. He had become everything she used to admire, just, composed, respected. And she had become the kind of person they once whispered about in cautionary tales. The irony wasn't lost on her. She, the lawyer who once fought for justice, was now begging for it. And he, the abandoned child, was the one tasked with delivering it. Her heart pounded as the gavel slammed down. The room went still. In that moment, one thought cut through the fog of panic in her mind. What happens when the person you hurt the most is the one who decides your fate? The answer was about to unfold in front of everyone. Long before she was a defendant and he was a judge, there was a different world, simpler, softer, stitched together by Sunday rituals and promises whispered over cafeteria tables and cracked playground benches. Back then, her name was still something sacred in his eyes, Miss Claire, or sometimes when he was feeling brave enough, Godmom. She hadn't expected to feel anything the first time she met him. It was part of a volunteer program her firm encouraged, mentorship, community outreach, the kind of polished service work that made annual reports look good. A weekend here, a donation there. But Elijah wasn't a statistic. He was this small, serious boy with eyes too old for his years and a voice barely louder than a whisper. He didn't smile much at first. She remembered the way he'd sit beside her at the community center, coloring in silence, glancing up only to see if she was still there. And she always was. At first, Claire had grown up in Connecticut with clean sidewalks and summer camps. Elijah came from a neighborhood where the sidewalks cracked like broken teeth and gunshots at night were more lullaby than shock. He lived with his grandmother, a kind woman with tired eyes and too many jobs. His father was gone. His mother lost in the system. So when Claire showed up, sharp suit, white teeth, endless energy, he didn't quite know what to make of her. She didn't talk down to him. She didn't pity him. She listened. And in return, piece by piece, he let her in. Over time, their weekends became sacred. She'd help him with his math homework. He'd read her Bible verses he memorized to impress his pastor. They had routines, traditions, ice cream after every good report card, movie nights on her office floor with a borrowed projector and Chinese takeout. She bought him his first tie. He wore it to church and said he felt like a lawyer. Like you, he whispered, grinning ear to ear. When his grandma got sick, it was Claire who stayed late at the hospital, who brought soup, who held Elijah's hand when the machine started beeping faster and the nurses moved too quickly. When she passed, Claire offered to help him through foster placement. She even spoke to a social worker about long-term guardianship. But then things shifted. Her firm took on a massive corporate case, high-stakes national attention. Claire saw an opening, a ladder to climb. The hours got longer. The weekends shrank. One Sunday became two, two became six. She told herself she'd decall. She'd make it up to him, but she didn't. And one day, without any clear moment of goodbye, she simply stopped showing up. Elijah waited. At first with confidence, then with doubt, and finally with that cold acceptance only abandonment can teach a child. He didn't cry, not in front of anyone, but every missed birthday carved itself into his ribs. Every unanswered letter taught him a lesson. People like her didn't stay. Promises were just words, and love, if it ever was love, was conditional. Claire buried it all, focused on her cases, built a reputation, won awards, pushed the memory of that little boy into some dusty, quiet part of her mind she rarely visited. But late at night, when the noise faded and the city outside her penthouse window fell asleep, she sometimes saw his face. Not angry, just waiting, like he always had. He, meanwhile, learned to build walls, foster homes, part-time jobs, scholarships earned not by luck but by relentless determination. He devoured books, studied policy, chased justice like it owed him something. He didn't talk about Claire, not even when asked, but her ghost walked beside him in every courtroom, every decision to do better than those who failed him. And now here they were. Claire never thought the boy she left behind would grow into the man seated above her, wielding power with the same steady hands she once held when he was afraid. She had always believed that some choices faded with time. But the past, it seemed, didn't just disappear, it waited. It remembered. And sometimes it put on a black robe and asked you to account for yourself. She didn't know if he hated her. She didn't know if he remembered the good or only the betrayal. What she did know, standing there with her dignity unraveling thread by thread, was that this wasn't just a trial about fraud. This was about something deeper, something far older. A broken promise, a reckoning, a debt long overdue. The years that followed her disappearance from his life did not come gently. They arrived like winter, cold, relentless, stripping everything bare. Elijah was 12 when the last thread of certainty in his world unraveled. His grandmother had passed, and Claire, his godmom, the only adult who made him feel visible, was simply gone. No explanation, no visit, no letter, just absence, and absence for a child is its own kind of violence. He moved through the foster system like wind through cracks in old walls. Homes changed, schools changed, faces blurred, but the lesson stayed the same: trust no one, expect nothing. He learned to fold his pain into silence, to wear composure like a second skin. And even as the world tried to grind him down, Elijah learned to push back, with books, with discipline, with purpose. While his classmates fell into traps set by poverty and rage, he buried himself in study. He didn't have time for resentment. But sometimes, on the long bus rides between schools, or when the dorm room was too quiet, he'd hear her voice again. Not in cruelty, in memory, telling him he was smart, that he could be anything, that she was proud of him. And then the bitterness would return, curling inside his stomach like smoke. If she believed in him so much, why didn't she stay? Claire, meanwhile, was ascending. After landing a coveted role on a white-collar litigation team, her star began to rise fast. She bought a condo in Midtown, wore tailored suits, her calendar filled with meetings, galas, and courtroom victories. She told herself she had made the right choice, that Elijah would be fine, that kids are resilient, that she had to choose her career. It wasn't until years later, when she was sipping champagne on a rooftop overlooking the city, that a colleague casually asked about the boy she used to mentor. "You really lit up when you talked about him," he'd said. She gave a tight smile, brushed it off with a joke, and changed the subject. But that night she couldn't sleep. Not because of guilt, because of uncertainty. Had he become something or nothing at all? The truth was, Claire had convinced herself that leaving him was an act of mercy. She was too busy, too messy, too ambitious to be a stable figure in any child's life. Better to disappear than disappoint slowly. At least that was the story she sold herself. But deep down, she knew. She hadn't left to protect him. She left to protect herself from the weight of connection, from the fear of failure, from the raw vulnerability of love that wasn't transactional. As she rose, she also began to bend, ethically, professionally, and quietly at first. At her firm, winning meant everything. Clients expected results, and soon shortcuts didn't feel like compromises, they felt like strategy. She began moving money between accounts, masking conflicts of interest, subtly manipulating invoices. No one noticed, or if they did, they didn't care. Results were results, and Claire was good, too good to fail, until she was. The first complaint came from a widower who noticed odd transfers after his wife's estate settlement. Then another from an elderly couple who couldn't account for missing funds. Claire denied, deflected, delayed. But the pattern was undeniable. What began as small infractions spiraled into a web of fraud too complex to conceal. When the indictment came, it was almost a relief, like something inevitable had finally arrived. While Claire's world collapsed beneath the weight of her choices, Elijah had built something of his own, quietly, deliberately. He earned a scholarship to Howard, then Yale Law. He worked internships he never thought he'd reach, wrote papers on systemic justice, mentored boys who reminded him of himself. He didn't talk about his past. He didn't have time for rage. But when the judge's gavel echoed in his courtroom for the first time, he remembered her. Not with hatred, with curiosity. Did she remember him? He never expected her to show up in his court. The moment he saw her name on the docket, something in him paused. Not broke, just shifted. And when she stepped through the door, her posture still perfect, her face older but unmistakable, he didn't feel power. He felt history, heavy, complicated, unresolved. Now she stood before him, accused of crimes far removed from their past but somehow still connected to it. Her fall from grace wasn't just legal, it was personal. She wasn't the woman he remembered. But maybe she never had been. For Claire, facing him was like looking into a mirror held up by time. She saw everything she had tried to forget. The boy with the hopeful eyes, the promises she broke, the cost of her ambition. She had thought she could outrun her past, but the past doesn't disappear. It evolves, it grows, and sometimes it becomes the judge. The silence between them weighed more than any gavel ever could. She stood there, framed in the fluorescent courtroom light, the same way she had once stood in a church doorway, calling his name with a smile and a bag of books. But there was no smile now, only the ghost of one, frozen on her lips, trying to remember how to breathe in a room where the air had turned thick with memory. Claire kept her gaze locked on him, half in disbelief, half in a quiet, desperate plea. Say something. Recognize me, please. But Elijah didn't blink, didn't move. His face was stone, not because he felt nothing, but because he had spent a lifetime learning how to feel without showing it. He hadn't known what to expect the day her case hit his desk. Part of him wanted to recuse himself. Part of him wanted to meet her gaze and ask 1,000 questions at once. But what came strongest, the part he didn't anticipate, was the dull, cold ache of recognition, not the kind that screamed, the kind that sighed. He had imagined this moment before as a teenager, as a law student, as a young man with too much pain tucked beneath a pressed shirt and a clean tie. In those old daydreams when he was still raw, she always cried. She always apologized. He always got the last word. But reality wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and far more complicated. Claire shifted her weight, her fingers twisting slightly at her sides. She wanted to speak, but knew the courtroom was not the place for sentiment. Still, the silence hurt more than any sentence could have. It wasn't cold, it was distant. Controlled, professional. He wasn't going to make this personal. And that somehow was what cut deepest. "Counselor," Elijah said finally, his voice even, deliberate. "Do you understand the charges presented before you?" The courtroom stirred slightly. No one else seemed to notice the way the word counselor landed between them like a wall. Claire nodded, her voice catching for a second before she answered. "Yes, Your Honor." It was the first time she had called him anything. It felt strange, like borrowing a word from a language you used to speak fluently and suddenly forgot. He moved through the pretrial procedures with meticulous care. Fair, thorough, composed. To anyone else in the room, it was business as usual, just another case, just another judge. But to Claire, every word he spoke felt layered, full of the things he wasn't saying. And beneath her calm, beneath the decades of courtroom polish and legal confidence, something began to crack. He remembered everything, not in vivid detail but in feeling. He remembered the soft sound of her laugh, the way she once knelt to tie his shoes before Sunday service, the first time she made him feel like he could be someone important. And he remembered how it all stopped. No warning, no explanation. One day she was the brightest part of his week. The next she was a silence he had to grow up inside of. She thought about speaking to him after court, asking for 5 minutes in chambers, maybe less. To explain, not excuse, but explain. But as the hearing closed and he dismissed the room, he didn't look up. He simply gathered his notes and left through the judge's door. No eye contact, no sign of recognition, just procedure. Claire stood motionless for a beat too long as the rest of the room moved on without her. The bailiff gave her a curious glance, as if sensing something deeper. But she only nodded and gathered her things like a woman who had just been sentenced by silence alone. That night she sat in her apartment, the city humming outside her windows like nothing had changed. But everything had. The past hadn't come for revenge. It had come for justice, not in anger, but in its purest, most painful form. Calm, structured accountability. She thought about the little boy he once was, how she used to cup his face in her hands and tell him he mattered, and how, in the moment she left, she had proven the opposite. The weight of that contradiction never left her. It simply slept beneath her ambition. Until now. And Elijah, he didn't go home triumphant. He didn't pour a drink or sit by a window replaying the day. He went to his small office, took off his robe, and sat in the quiet. He didn't know what to feel. Part of him wanted to confront her. Part of him didn't trust what might come out if he did. He had spent so many years building himself from ashes that he was terrified of what one conversation might undo. Was he still that boy looking for answers? Or was he now the man who no longer needed them? For now he chose distance. It was safe, clean. But in that space between them, across decades, memories, and a courtroom aisle, neither of them could pretend it didn't matter. The reunion had happened. And even in silence, it had changed everything. The trial began under harsh lights and hushed tones, with a sense of gravity that didn't need to be spoken aloud. The courtroom, though filled with lawyers, clerks, and a dozen strangers, felt like it belonged to only two people, Claire and Elijah. Everything else was background noise. He sat above, robed in neutrality, while she sat below, wrapped in quiet guilt and carefully chosen words. The prosecution started strong. The evidence was meticulous. Mismanaged accounts, falsified signatures, and a paper trail that twisted like a snake through years of financial deception. Elderly victims testified, some confused, some angry, all betrayed. A widow recounted how her husband trusted Claire to manage their retirement fund, only to die not knowing half of it had vanished. A disabled veteran spoke softly, saying he felt like he'd been robbed twice, once by life and once by someone he thought was supposed to protect him. Claire didn't look away, not once. She listened to every word, every tearful recollection. Each testimony carved itself into her like names on stone. This wasn't some white-collar mistake or a PR disaster. These were real people, real pain. And behind every accusation was the echo of the thing she once taught Elijah to believe in: accountability. Her lawyer tried to humanize her, painting a picture of overwork, poor delegation, and an assistant who had handled most of the paperwork. But the truth had already landed. Claire had signed. Claire had known. And worst of all, Claire hadn't stopped it. Elijah sat quietly, face unreadable, but inside he was far from still. Each time a victim spoke, he watched her, not to see if she'd cry, but to see if she cared. And she did. That was clear. The remorse was real. But was it enough? There were moments during the trial when their eyes met. Not long, not dramatic, but fleeting glances charged with history. In those glances lived the childhood he had never gotten to finish, and the adulthood she had shaped by walking away. She didn't ask for mercy with her mouth, but her silence did. And yet, mercy wasn't what the court demanded. The court demanded justice, justice without bias, justice without memory. As the trial moved into its third day, the defense requested a recess. Claire sat alone at the table, her hands folded, her eyes lowered. For the first time, she looked smaller, not because of guilt, but because of exhaustion, the kind that comes from finally facing everything you've spent years avoiding. When court resumed, Elijah addressed the room with the same calm he had held since the beginning. But this time, something shifted in his voice. A weight, a tremor. He instructed the jury on their duty. He reminded them that emotion must be separate from law, that the evidence, not sentiment, would decide guilt. But even as he spoke, a question pulsed quietly between every word. What do we do when justice and memory collide? Claire's attorney gave his closing argument, measured, careful. He asked the jury to see her as a person, not a headline, to understand that people are not only the sum of their worst decisions. And yet, when he sat down, there was no applause, no relief, only stillness. Then came the prosecution's closing. It was sharp, direct, ruthless. She was not desperate, the prosecutor said. She was not cornered. She was successful, trusted. And she chose to break that trust. Repeatedly, no rebuttal followed. The silence returned, heavy, final. As the jury exited to deliberate, Claire sat still, her gaze fixed not on the judge's bench but on the floor, like she couldn't bear to look up. She didn't expect forgiveness. She wasn't sure she deserved it, but she had shown up. And somehow that mattered. Elijah retreated to chambers, alone with his thoughts. For the first time since the case began, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of who she was to him, who she had been and who she had become. He wasn't the boy who waited at the window anymore. He was a man who had built himself without her. But even now, even with all his power, he couldn't decide which hurt more, what she did to her clients, or what she did to him. And so the question remained, Could justice be fair when forgiveness still hung unspoken in the air? The courtroom was still, unnervingly still, as the jury filed back in. 12 strangers, now keepers of fate. Claire sat upright, but the pressure on her chest made it feel like breathing was an act of will. Her palms were damp against the cool surface of the defense table. Outside the windows, the world kept turning, cars passed, clouds drifted, lives continued untouched. But inside that room, time had narrowed to a pinpoint. This moment, this verdict, and above it all sat Elijah, unmoved on the outside, but inside something was shifting. The foreman rose, paper in hand, face unreadable. On the charge of wire fraud, we find the defendant guilty. The words rang out like iron falling against stone, final, heavy, expected but still shocking in their reality. Claire didn't cry. She nodded once slowly, as if acknowledging something that had been coming for years. Not just the legal consequences, but the reckoning, the closure. Her attorney placed a hand gently on her shoulder, but she barely felt it. Her eyes, steady now, slowly lifted, meeting Elijah's. And for the first time since the trial began, he didn't look away. There was no gloat in his gaze, no satisfaction. Just something painfully human, tired, searching, maybe even sad. He cleared his throat, voice quiet but clear. "Sentencing will be scheduled in 30 days, he said, his tone formal, professional. "Until then, Ms. Bennett will remain under supervised release." And then, in a pause so slight it almost wasn't there, he added softly, "Court is adjourned." The gavel dropped, but no one moved. Claire stood slowly, unsure whether to leave or stay. She didn't want to look back. She didn't want to see the faces in the gallery or the press outside waiting to tear apart the story. But before she could take a step, a bailiff approached and handed her an envelope, unmarked, except for her name. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside was a single note. No signature, just 4 handwritten words: "You showed up. That matters." Her breath caught. She looked up instinctively, but Elijah had already disappeared behind the judge's door. The silence hit harder than the verdict. She stood frozen, the paper in her hand like a second sentence, one she didn't understand at first. What did it mean? That he forgave her? That he did? Or that sometimes forgiveness isn't a declaration, it's a decision to stop letting pain lead? Days passed, then weeks, and as sentencing approached, Claire felt less like she was falling and more like she was finally standing still, facing what she'd spent years outrunning. She started writing letters, not to Elijah but to the people she had harmed. Not excuses, not legal jargon, just words, honest ones, full of regret, full of ownership. She didn't expect anyone to write back. But it didn't matter. For once, she wasn't trying to save herself. She was just showing up. And then sentencing day came. She wore gray, no makeup, no jewelry, just herself, stripped of all the armor she had built over 3 decades. She entered the courtroom prepared for prison or perhaps some form of limbo. What she didn't expect was what came next. Elijah read the pre-sentencing report, then looked up. "Ms. Bennett," he said, "you've caused real harm. What you did wasn't a mistake, it was a pattern. But the court has also reviewed the letters you wrote to your victims, and theirs to you." He paused. "Some of them chose not to forgive. That is their right. But some did." Claire's throat tightened. She hadn't known. "You've begun the process of accountability," he continued, steady. "And while justice must be served, its purpose isn't only to punish. It's also to restore when possible." He looked at her directly now, not as a judge, not as a child abandoned, but as a man who had learned that justice and mercy are not enemies. "You are hereby sentenced to 3 years probation, 6 months of community service, mandatory restitution, and enrollment in a victim's accountability program." Claire blinked. She couldn't speak. She wasn't walking away free, but she wasn't being destroyed either. As she turned to leave the courtroom, she glanced back one last time. Elijah wasn't watching her. He was writing something, already moving on to the next case, the next burden. But in that quiet act of measured justice, she understood the truth. Sometimes forgiveness isn't loud. It isn't a hug or a dramatic speech. Sometimes it's just a decision not to crush someone when you have every right to. And sometimes that's enough. After the courtroom emptied and the noise of the outside world swallowed up the last echoes of the gavel, what remained wasn't the memory of a legal battle, or the headlines that followed, or even the verdict itself. What lingered was something much quieter and far more powerful. A question, one that reaches far beyond courtrooms, past the suits and the transcripts and the evidence boxes. A question that speaks directly to the heart of every person who's ever been hurt, or done the hurting. What do we owe each other when the past won't stay buried? Because this was never just a story about a white lawyer and her black godson. This was never just about fraud or legal restitution. This was a story about the things we run from and what happens when we finally stop running. Claire had built an entire life on movement, career goals, image, power. But behind all that was a single moment of abandonment she could never quite shake. Elijah had built his life on resilience, on not needing anyone, on strength forged from silence. But strength is never about pretending pain doesn't exist. True strength is acknowledging it and choosing not to pass it on. Their reunion didn't come with hugs or healing words. There was no movie scene apology. What happened between them wasn't reconciliation in the traditional sense. It was deeper than that. It was something more honest. Two people, once bound by love and broken by fear, stood in the same space again, and neither looked away. And sometimes that is the most human thing we can do. Because the truth is, we all leave people behind, intentionally or not. In relationships, in friendships, in families, through fear, ambition, pain, or simple neglect. We think silence protects us. We think forgetting is easier than confronting. But time has a way of circling back, not to punish, but to invite us to look again, with new eyes. And sometimes, like Elijah, we find ourselves in positions of power, moral, emotional, even institutional, where we are asked to decide. Will we hold on to what hurt us, or will we transform it? Not for them, not even for justice, but for ourselves. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's not about saying it's okay. Because sometimes it's not. What Claire did was wrong, and she paid for it, not just with a sentence, but with years of private shame, a life that looked perfect on paper but hollow in truth. But the real punishment was that she knew exactly when she stopped being who she said she would be. And the real redemption came not in a lighter sentence, but in showing up anyway. So here's the invitation for everyone still listening, still reading, still wondering what all of this means. Who in your life deserves an apology you've never given? What pain have you been carrying, thinking it made you strong, when really it's just made you tired? What would it mean to show up, even now, especially now, for someone you left behind? You don't need a courtroom. You don't need a robe or a gavel. You don't even need the perfect words. You just need to be willing to step into the discomfort of truth and stay there long enough to grow something honest from it. Because in the end, justice is not just about punishment. It's about repair, restoration, return. And redemption isn't a clean slate, it's a stained one, that you choose to write something new over. Claire's story isn't over. Elijah's story isn't finished, and neither is yours. So maybe, before you move on to the next thing, ask yourself, what silence have I let speak for me? And what would happen if I broke it? We all carry unfinished stories. But sometimes, just showing up is the first sentence of a better ending.